One of the most famous prevalence among the nobility of the House of Habsburg is the so-called Habsburg Jaw, a protrusion of the upper or lower jaw, which is known in general dentistry as prognathism. This is where the jawbones protrudes beyond an imaginary line of one's skull, or in Greek, it means forward jaw, prognathism. In European history, there have been several famous monarchs who had issues with prognathism, where the lower jaw protrudes forward. This was very famous among the Spanish, Austrian, German, Habsburg royal families. Most of the causes were due to rampant years of long incest among the powerful royal families. This was heavily the case with Habsburg Spain, where in 184 years they ruled Spain. 9 out of 11 total marriages were incestuous. Due to the incest, the family's genetic line progressively deteriorated until the last heir, King Charles II, was physically incapable of fathering heirs, ending the Spanish Habsburg line. Charles II's jaw was so bad, he struggled to eat or even speak. He was also very weak and mentally handicapped. He was often nicknamed the Bewitched or the Hex, and the joke was, it was said that his wife thought he was so ugly that his face scared her. Emperor Charles V, who was king of Spain, also had the same issue with the Habsburg jaw, which was so bad he could not close his mouth. Reportedly, there was a peasant once that shouted at Charles, saying, "Your Majesty, shut your mouth. The flies of this country are very insolent." In Austria, with the House of Habsburg, they had the same issue. It was often nicknamed the Austrian lip. One of the most famous Habsburgs that had such a protruding lower lip was Marie Antoinette, who became Queen of France, the later wife of King Louis XVI. Overall, the Habsburg dynasty was one of the most influential in Europe, but due to its infamous inbreeding, it later became its downfall. The Habsburg dynasty later became a human laboratory for researchers with modern dentistry to study how to prevent such rare diseases. Many of the Habsburg royal family's members' portraits have actually been used and mapped out to prevent such genetic issues. Prior to modern dentistry, there were no treatments for this condition of prognathism. You simply just had to endure such genetic issues. Today, the common treatment is a combination of orthodontics, using, say, braces, and a combination of orthognathic surgery, which helps to correct the conditions of the jaw and your lower face to make one's jaw more straight in position. Overall, the Habsburg jaw in the end shows why inbreeding and incest are frowned upon in the modern world, and it shows its negative effects with harmful consequences. A short little documentary I made, of course, on prognathism, of course, often called Habsburg jaw, which was something that Spanish Habsburgs had a lot of problem with, which I'll, of course, talk about today. So anyway, like I said, today I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk about more about the age of absolutism. Of course, I'm going to switch from, talking about the Bourbon, regime in France that was there. I want to discuss about the Habsburgs, which the Habsburgs were famous royal families that kind of go back to like the late Middle Ages. So I'll kind of talk about them. They do kind of split it up, if you know about this, into like the Spanish Habsburgs, mostly concentrated in Spain, but we'll talk also about the Habsburg monarchy, which is mostly in Austria, around Austria, in southern Europe as well. So we'll discuss them a lot today. The Habsburgs, are pretty famous. They go back to like the Middle Ages. In fact, quite older than some of the other dynasties in Europe. I think maybe like you have one, maybe the Rurik dynasty in Russia that's also pretty old, that goes back to the Middle Ages. But like the other ones we'll talk about later, not quite as old compared to them. You can see that's a famous palace, by the way, the Belvedere, which is one of their palaces that they constructed in Vienna, which Vienna is one of the famous capitals, of course, of the Habsburg monarchy later. But the Habsburgs were known for controlling a lot of lands. Even though they go back to the Middle Ages, but by the 16th, 17th centuries, the Habsburgs control vast amounts of land that are in Europe. Pretty much from Western to Central Europe, the New World, uh, at one point in the Pacific, Indian Oceans, also the Philippines and all that, and of course, uh, you know, pretty much had an extensive empire, like especially the Spanish Habsburgs was pretty massive in size, like 4 or 5 million square miles at one point. They have different, like I said, branches we'll kind of get into and discuss that are kind of well known. They have the main ones like the Habsburg monarchy, which it's called different names, Habsburg Empire or Austria or Austrian Empire, of course, later. They're mostly in like the southern part of Europe, primarily. Then the Spanish Habsburgs are more controlling, like in Spain. I think at one point they controlled Portugal for a while. Parts of Europe, like Italy, Netherlands, the New World, the Philippines, all those are areas that they control at one point. I think I've got some other images here, of course, of the Habsburgs. But the Habsburgs, they say the name Habsburg. It's spelled different ways. You'll see it spelled with a P, also Hap, like HAP, Habsburgs. They say the name is coined from a castle that they think was built sometime in the High Middle Ages called Habsburg Castle, which I think there's a debate about where it is. But there's one I know they claim that's now in Switzerland, and so they think that's the origin of where the name originally came from. If you know about the Habsburgs, for a long time they controlled the position of Holy Roman Emperor, like from the 14th, I think 40s, up to like 1806. Majority of the Holy Roman emperors were from the House of Habsburg. I think it was a few. I think I want to say a little later, like well, I think it was the 1700s. I think it was, but I think yes, 18th century. There was a few where they weren't, but most of them for 300-400 years, control that position for a long time. I've got a map kind of showing you here the kind of the dominions or domains, I guess, of where all the Habsburg lands were. At one point, they controlled. Yeah, they do kind of later kind of divide them into two kind of branches. Like in the red, you've got the kind of Spanish Habsburgs. They dub them later, which is kind of was considered a kind of like a senior branch, I think, at one point. And that one is famous for monarchs like Emperor Charles V, who was also the King of Spain. And then, of course, his son Philip II as well. And then you can see the other one, junior branch, they kind of separate, is the Austrian Habsburgs, if you want to call them that, Habsburg monarchy or Habsburg Empire. And yeah, mostly they're concentrated in southern Europe, like Austria, Hungary, Transylvania, Bohemia, in Switzerland, I think at one point, northern Italy, and parts of Germany, and they're kind of connected with the Holy Roman Empire because a lot of the rulers of the Austrian monarchy are also emperors as well. That here's, of course, some images, of course, of the House Habsburg. Of course, I'm going to first talk about the Spanish Habsburgs. We'll, of course, get into them. But you can see there's a bunch of them right there in that image. I think mostly in the middle, you've got Charles V, and on the left, that is, I believe that's, of course, King Charles II. I think on the right, that might be Joanna, who was also a ruler as well. But yeah, Emperor Charles V, who you see here, is really one of the most famous of the Spanish Habsburgs. If you know much about him, he was a grandson of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabel the First of Castile. Remember those two because we had talked about them before. Those two rulers, of course, had been involved in influencing Columbus's voyages to the Americas and all that. And they really consider him to be one of the greatest monarchs of the 16th century. At one point, his lands control so much that it's on like 5 continents. And um, well, I'll get to it later, but he's kind of known for that Habsburg Jaw. You can see there, which is well known with that particular dynasty. But the Habsburgs have, if you look at the amount of monarchs that they had, that they controlled Spain, the first one actually went back to he had a father whose name was Philip the First of Castile. He was considered really the first Habsburg to rule Spain. I think he was from the Netherlands originally. And he was married to Joanna of Castile. I think I've got an image of them showing those two right here. But yeah, Philip the First on the left, who, by the way, didn't reign long. I think he died in 1506. And then she on the right actually was the main ruler, Joanna of Castile, who actually went mad during her reign, and she was known as Joanna the Mad. But that's basically Charles V's parents, basically there. And Philip the First, I think, had a nickname. He was called the Fair or the Handsome, that kind of thing. But they think that maybe is where the whole Habsburg Jaw thing comes from. They think it was some kind of hereditary gene that was brought to Spain. They think it was a recessive gene that caused that prognathism. Of course, the so-called Habsburg Jaw, of course, that will be later. Here's kind of an image of kind of a map of Charles V's, by the way, empire, which was, pretty massive at the time. His empire, he reigned over an area which was at one point, they think, something like 1.5 million square miles. If you want kilometers, it was 4 million square kilometers. It was considered probably the largest empire since Charlemagne, which goes back to like, close to 800 AD or CE. And so Charles mostly spent predominantly his entire reign trying to defend it, his whole empire, which was massive in size, which his empire wasn't just in Europe. You see, it was like Spain, Portugal, and parts of Central Europe and Italy. But it was also based, you can see, in the New World, like New Spain, Peru, in the Americas. And they were even getting into like, you see, into like Asia, like India, the Philippines later as well. So it's a massive empire. And Philip was known for a lot of things. I think we had already talked about this before about Philip. Philip, was the one that was involved at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation and all that, where he tried to stop Martin Luther with his so-called Edict of Worms. And then 1555, he was forced to create this peace of Augsburg, between Catholics and Lutherans and all that. So he had to deal with a lot of those kind of religious problems throughout his country as well. And then also, I think he kind of caused the whole English Reformation too, if you know that, because he refused to allow Henry VIII to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who was related to Charles V and all that. And so, yeah, that's kind of issue with that. We go back up here to Charles V. Over time, he was forced to eventually step down. He actually abdicated his throne in 1556, and a lot of it was due to health issues, which were caused by prognathism, which I just talked about in that little short documentary, so-called Habsburg Jaw, or sometimes called lip, which they think a lot, like I said, was caused from inbreeding of the Habsburg royal family. This is something that keeps being, brought down to, his son, grandson, great-grandson, great-grandson, until it kills the dynasty off, of course, long term with that. So kind of talking about that period of his reign, like Charles V. So he was really considered one of the greatest rulers at the time overall as that with that monarch. Oh, here's another image, by the way, showing maybe a kind of a bigger one, showing like his vast lands to kind of give you an idea. But all those areas in green at one point they controlled. I think what later Portugal as well was controlled briefly by the Spanish also. So pretty massive in size overall. Now they got his son, who's also well known, which is King Philip II, who had a nickname. He was called the Prudent. And he reigned from 1556 to 1598. He reigns during a time, by the way, that's often called the Spanish Golden Age. Some people call it like the Spanish Golden Century or something like that. It's got other names that it has. But he's gonna. What ends up happening if you go back to that map there, which is kind of famous? What occurs is that Philip actually, after he stepped down, abdicated, he actually split the empire up. That's one of the things he did. And so his son got most of the Spanish lands, like Spain in the New World, the Philippines, and he also got southern Italy as well, like Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia. I think all that went to him. And then what happened was he had a brother in Germany, which was Ferdinand I. He was the Archduke of Austria, and he ended up getting basically the Austrian lands. And so basically that split the whole Habsburgs into kind of like two branches, one Spanish and one Austrian. And so that's what you get afterwards because of that. So yeah, Philip, yeah, he lives during this time called the Golden Age, which was a period of flourishing arts and literature throughout that time period. It's also like the peak of the Spanish Empire when it's like close to like almost 5 million square miles at one point. The Spanish Empire is in size, which the Spanish Habsburgs, their dynasty ends in 1700. But really, if you get up to like close to like the end of it, like close to 1700, it's actually in decline. It's something it's kind of known for. Of course, if you study about that time, the whole Spanish Golden Age, they have a lot of famous literature that's written, like Don Quixote, you may have heard of, which is by Miguel de Cervantes. He, of course, wrote that in the early 1600s. So that was kind of a series of novels that are kind of well known that people have read before. And then also they had this famous painter you may have heard of named Diego Velázquez, who's well known, who did different paintings like Las Meninas, I think is the name of that painting right there, which both those are kind of famous. So yeah, Don Quixote, early 1600s, of course, and then the artist Diego Velázquez is a little later, more into like the mid 17th century, but he's known for doing a lot of famous paintings in Spain that's now famous today overall. Going back to Philip II, he was also known as a defender of the Catholic faith. He was kind of a proponent of the Counter-Reformation to try and stop the Protestants. There's several things he's well known for. I think the big thing he was more successful for was in 1571, where he stopped an invasion of Europe by the Ottoman Empire off the coast of Greece, the so-called Battle of Lepanto. It's called. I think it happened on October 7th, 1571. And a coalition of Catholic states, which involved Spain and some states in Italy, were able to basically crush the Ottoman Empire's navy, which was an interesting battle. I think I've got an image showing the Battle of Lepanto, but it was considered one of the last major battles where galley ships were used. Which what galley ships were? They're basically ships where they use like rowing vessels, like the ancient triremes and things like that from a long time ago. It's one of the last naval battles was fought like that, of course. So interesting about that. But they prevented that, and that he was kind of seen as this defender of Christians in Europe and so on. Oh, and then later, we won't talk about this today, but later in 1588, Philip tried to invade England. He had been, by the way, if you know about Philip, he actually married the Queen of England, who was Mary the First, later known as Bloody Mary. That had been a very unpopular relationship in England. And um, After his wife died, he decided to try and invade when Queen Elizabeth was the ruler, Queen Elizabeth I, but it was unsuccessful. So-called defeat of the Spanish Armada in the summer of 1588. And so I think sometimes they mark that as the beginning of maybe when the Spanish Empire starts to kind of decline a little bit. But between the 16th up to like the 18th century, it starts declining for sure. So that, and I'll talk also about some of the other rulers they had. I'll kind of go into it too, just kind of since we're talking about the Habsburgs. I'll kind of mention about some of the other rulers that came in later. They had also Philip III, who you see on the left, was the son of King Philip as well. And then you also have King Philip IV. Those were like his sons and grandsons that kind of reigned over the Spanish uh, Empire, who reigned, by the way, in the 17th century. I think the one on the right is more famous. Philip IV was sometimes known as the Planet King, they call him, because I think under him, it's like when the Spanish Habsburg Empire peaks, which was, I think it peaked at almost 5 million square miles. It was massive in size at the time. And they say that's the peak of the Spanish Golden Age because Philip IV was called also the Planet King because he collected a lot of art. He was a big patron of the arts at the time. And I was talking about Diego Velázquez, I think was painting around that same time and all that. So that's kind of, and then you have one more ruler, of course, they always talk about with the Habsburgs, who's Charles II. He's the last ruler that reigns till 1700. And he would have nicknames. They called him the Bewitched or also the Hexed because he had all kinds of issues, which a lot of them were predominantly physical, mental issues that he had. He suffered from a lot of inbreeding issues, of course, which I talked about, the so-called Habsburg Jaw, which I think I've got. I think I had another image I thought I had showing the different people that had it. They think his father had it, and he was, Philip IV, before they kind of see it pronounced there. And of course, Charles V also had it as well. But it got progressively worse as it got down to Charles II. And it got to the point where he couldn't really do much physically, mentally as ruler. And he didn't have any children, which was another problem overall. And they do think that what happened because of the fact that he doesn't have, an heir, it creates a conflict afterwards, which it leads to a war in Europe. When ends up Charles II ends up giving the throne to Philip of Anjou, who is the grandson of Louis XIV, who's on the Bourbon throne of France, and it's going to eventually lead to the Bourbons taking over Spain. So Habsburg Spain becomes Bourbon Spain, and it creates this really turbulent war in Europe that is called the Spanish Succession War, where the Habsburgs and the Bourbons try to fight for control over Habsburg Empire, and I think Louis XIV wanted to combine the Spanish and the French empires together and all that, and the Habsburgs didn't want that to occur. And so what happens later, the Bourbons eventually take it over. They'll eventually do take it. Philip of Anjou becomes King Philip V, of course, of Spain. But it's like I think it keeps going. Like the actual empire of Bourbon Spain peaks at, like I said, close to 5 million or maybe just over 5 million square miles, which I think 1810 was the peak of it. And after the Latin American revolutions, they lost all that territory later. So yeah, all because of the Habsburg Jaw, all the inbreeding of the royal family. They think that most of their marriages were kind of like that. They were trying to keep the bloodline, I guess, within the family and all that, and it ended up eventually destroying it. There, of course, is Philip V on the right. But yeah, Louis XIV was not. I think he wanted to get the throne himself. I think was the deal with that. But it ended up going to his grandson, and the two kingdoms, Bourbon, France and Bourbon Spain, or remained separate after that war. Now I'm gonna move on next. I'm gonna talk for a few minutes on, of course, something else. Of course, it's more famous with the Habsburgs. I'm gonna get into it. I'm gonna discuss about the Habsburg Empire, Habsburg monarchy that really controls Central Europe, which the areas they control are predominantly Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, parts of Transylvania, northern Italy, the Netherlands at one point, especially by the 18th century. It is considered one of the most famous empires, of course, in Europe. Here's kind of a map showing you what the Habsburg Empire kind of evolves into, which really that might be more by the 18th, 19th century that you're looking at. But it's of course known by different names. They never really had an official name of the Habsburg Empire, Habsburg monarchy, Austrian Empire, or simply just Austria. I think is, of course, the name they started using by the 18th, 19th centuries. Austro-Hungarian Empire or Austria-Hungary is another name they used by up to like World War One. And the Habsburg monarchy was a multi-ethnic empire. It was made up of different kinds of peoples and nationalities that lived throughout that region. A majority of people were Catholic as the main kind of religious faith. But in those areas you're looking at, you can see there was, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, Slovakia, West Galicia, East Galicia, Transylvania, etc. There are all kinds of peoples that lived there. You had Germans, you had Hungarians, Czechs, Moravians, Slovaks, Polish people, Slovenes, Serbians, Croats, Bulgarians, Romanians, Italians, and lots of Jews also living throughout that area as well. So it's made up of multiple ethnicities and different languages. Although German becomes the main language they use, although in Hungary they don't really like that German being used as much. But I think up to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, really Austria and Hungary, the ones that have any real power later, especially by the 19th century. I'll get to it later, not today, but because of all these different nationalities, that's why you end up with the Austro-Hungarian Empire being broken up. That because they lost World War One, because they were on the German side during the war. But today in that area you're looking at, you have all these different countries that eventually merge later, like the Czech Republic, and it was one of the main ones at the top where Bohemia is. Austria and Hungary are separated now. I think areas on the bottom, it's kind of where you get a lot of those Yugoslavian states. It'll be down there. I think Romania is kind of like in the eastern part where Transylvania is, and all that. So kind of showing you those different areas of where about where it is. You can see that's about the peak population too. Maybe 50 million people may have been the peak population of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think that's on the eve of maybe World War One, like going to the early 20th century. That's kind of probably what it looks like later. Yeah, kind of going back to it, but you can see all the areas that the Austrian monarchy, their empire, kind of controlled in that yellow area. So northern Italy, Germany, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, Transylvania. Those are all areas. One point Switzerland as well. Now I'm going to talk about first one of the famous rulers that really is well known, like in the modern times, early modern times, which is Emperor Leopold I. They really consider him to be one of the greatest Habsburg rulers of the Habsburg monarchy in the 1600s or 17th century. He reigned 1658 to 1705 for a little bit over 46 years. He is one of the longest reigning of the, I guess, direct male descendants of the Habsburg monarchy. I think the only one that's longer than that is probably Franz Joseph I. He reigned later. I think they call it Habsburg Lorraine dynasty sometimes. One of the last rulers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But yeah, he is considered one of the greatest rulers. By that time, they'd already split. The Spanish Habsburgs are almost coming to an end at that point. He's the one that actually tries to stop it, with the War of the Spanish Succession, which breaks out in 1701. He even tried to put his own son on the Spanish throne, but failed. But his biggest success was really expanding uh, the the uh, the empire of the Habsburg monarchy, which their biggest success was really the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, where the Habsburgs and the Turks tangled in what became known as in Europe at the time the so-called Great Turkish War, which was fought between 1683 to 1699. Even though I think Russia came in and fought as well in that war. And it involved also other powers too, like Poland or Polish with Lithuania was in it too. And Christians in Europe formed this alliance called the Holy League to prevent the Ottomans, who were Muslim, from overrunning parts of Europe. And so, yeah, Russia joined, I think, under Peter the Great at one point. And then Poland, Lithuania also joined as well, which they call it the Kingdom of Poland for short. And at one point, the Turks actually, 1683, laid siege to Vienna. It was actually surrounded by their forces. And so the Holy League had to rally forces to try and, retake the city at that point. And the imperial forces were actually aided by the King of Poland. He was named Jan Sobieski, sometimes called Jan the Third or John the Third, and he was able to rally enough forces with cavalry to eventually help lift the siege of Vienna, which happened in September of 1683. And so after that, that became kind of an important. I think they mark that as one of the turning points, really, in Central Europe with the Turks, because the Ottoman Empire is going to start declining between the 17th and the 19th centuries. And yeah, the war marks the end of the Ottoman Empire. It starts kind of losing territory. It's controlled in Central Europe, so they'll still have parts of Eastern Europe and all that, like around Yugoslavia and around Greece, etc. But the Ottomans are later kind of marked in the 1800s as being the so-called sick man of Europe, as the Russians called them later. But what ends up happening, if you go back to that map I think I had earlier right here, uh, the actual Ottoman Empire ends up with a lot of territory afterwards. So they end up with like parts of Hungary, parts of Transylvania as well. And I think also part of, I think it's called, I thought it was Slovenia or something like that is also taken as well afterwards in the so-called, I think it's called the Treaty of Karlowitz that ended the war and all that. And so that was considered to be kind of a turning point. And I guess for the Habsburgs, they'll begin to expand their territory and their larger empire in Southern Europe. Let me I'll kind of talk about it a little bit as well. But the Habsburgs were known for constructing a lot of different palaces. Vienna becomes like the capital eventually of the Habsburg monarch, the Habsburg Empire. It's one of their central cities, which behind me, by the way, that's a kind of an image of Vienna. I want to say in the 18th century. Anyway, they're one of their main palaces. I'll kind of show you like two main palaces they have. It's kind of famous that they built. That's well known. One is the Schönbrunn Palace, which is one of their summer palaces that's kind of well known, which was built, I think, kind of between the 16th and the 17th centuries. And the name Schönbrunn means beautiful well or beautiful spring because of nearby artesian well where they got some of their water. And it's believed that this particular palace was originally not called Schönbrunn, it was called Katterberg because they think it was started out as some kind of hunting lodge or an early palace of one of the Holy Roman emperors named Emperor Maximilian II, who lived in the 1500s. But over time, this palace becomes massive in size. It eventually grew to a type of Rococo type late Baroque style palace, which had 1,441 rooms in it. and it was kind of constructed and built by multiple rulers. I think it was kind of like the facade on the outside was kind of revised over many years. I think they say that Empress Maria Theresa and also Emperor Franz Joseph did most of the remodeling of it on the outside and also on the interior of the palace. But in Vienna, it is considered a major tourist attraction. I know before COVID, around 8 million people would visit the Schönbrunn Palace. I think that's not quite as much compared to, say, the Palace of Versailles, which I think might be double that to kind of give you an idea of the popularity of some of these palaces overall. They are known for a lot of, if you look at, Schönbrunn, a lot of the other palaces, they have, of course, a lot of parks and gardens that were added into it. It is known for having sculpted formal gardens, which are called the Great Parterre, which were designed by this landscape architect named Jean Triet, who was actually a protege of Andre Lenotre, who had actually, been the landscape architect that had been at the Palace of Versailles in France. And so obviously this particular palace, was heavily influenced by what, Louis XIV built in France. Also, if you know about Schönbrunn, it is famous for a zoo. They call it different names. The Tiergarten Schönbrunn, I think also just called Vienna Zoo as well, or Schönbrunn Zoo as well. And it was established in 1752, and it is considered, by the way, to be one of the oldest zoos in the world. I think it's famous for panda bears and other types of animals like koala bears and so on. But going back to the 18th, 19th century, it was kind of popular, of course, in Europe. So kind of showing an image there, of course, of that particular zoo. Here's another palace that they had as well. That's called different names. These are called the Belvedere, and it's actually a palace complex that was built. I think it was built between the 17th and 18th centuries by this Habsburg nobleman named Prince Eugene of Savoy, who, by the way, was actually famous as a field marshal. He was a very famous general in Europe who fought in numerous wars. And he ended up, I think he built two palace complexes. One is called the Lower Belvedere, and the one you're looking at is the Upper Belvedere, which is famous. And I think later what happened to it, I believe, was that it was eventually Maria Theresa, we get to later, bought it, and it became kind of one of her residences. And I think Emperor Joseph II and a few others also lived there as well. And I think it was going to be supposed to be it was actually going to be the residence of Franz Ferdinand. You know about that, who was going to be the next ruler of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he got assassinated, if you know about that, in 1914. And I think now I think they're used as museums mostly, primarily. Now, later, what happened, they have some other rulers that are kind of famous of the Habsburgs. One you see there is Emperor Charles VI, who was one of the sons of Leopold. He had another brother who I think reigned briefly, Joseph I, but he's only in power about 6 years because he died of smallpox. But he became more famous. If you know about Charles VI, he's the last direct male descendant of the Habsburgs. So some say that the male line or the main Habsburgs end in 1740 because of this, but it's continued kind of with his daughter, if you know about that, Maria Theresa, afterwards. And so he had this issue where he didn't have any male heirs that could take the throne. Issue is usually the term they use for an heir. He had only two daughters, Maria Theresa and Maria Anna. And so what happened was in 1713, he issued this thing called the Pragmatic Sanction, which you see there. And what the Pragmatic Sanction did was it basically said that the Habsburg monarchy's lands and all that could be inherited by a female. That way, I guess, wouldn't be carved up by other powers or whatever, or other nobility. And so Maria Theresa, you see on the left, would come in and she would, take over. And she, by the way, is the only female ruler of the Habsburg monarchy that they have. She is considered, by the way, one of the greatest female rulers in modern Europe. She's kind of up there with, Queen Elizabeth I, or maybe you, of course, may have heard of also Empress Elizabeth in Russia, and then also later Catherine the Great as well of Russia. And she had multiple titles. She was the Archduchess of Austria. She was the Queen of Bohemia, the Queen of Hungary, etc. And later, she ended up, if you know about this, also being Holy Roman Empress through marriage, because the Holy kind of a weird period, I guess, in the 18th century. But she had this husband she married named Francis Stephen, who was from Lorraine. That's him on the bottom there in the middle. He later ended up becoming Holy Roman Emperor, I think he was Holy Roman Emperor from 1745 to 1765. And it was one of the very few periods where Habsburg didn't really control the Holy Roman Emperor position, just elected position, by the way, in Europe. But if you know about it, she had all the real power behind the throne because hereditarily she controlled all the lands, etc. But he was really a figurehead, if you know about this. And yeah, it does say there, if you look at it, of course, in that image right there, they did have a lot of children. They had 16 children at one point. It's a lot of kids. A lot of children would die back then, by the way, with that. But yeah, they would actually create a new dynasty later. They usually dub it the Habsburg Lorraine dynasty, which kind of continues afterwards until World War One. 11 girls, 5 boys. Some of these rulers would be famous later that are well known. Like some of her famous children would be Emperor Joseph II, who I'll probably talk about the most, who was a ruler and also Holy Roman Emperor as well after his father, Francis I, died. He was Holy Roman Emperor from 1765 to 1790. He had a brother named Emperor Leopold II, who reigned briefly from 1790 to 92. And then don't forget about Marie Antoinette. That was their sister as well, who was later the Queen of France. Talk about Maria Theresa. She's known for a lot of different things. She was seen as this enlightened despot, or they call it sometimes enlightened absolutist. These were monarchs in Europe around the 18th century that started doing reforms to their state, trying to modernize the state and even trying to do things to help out their own people rather than making it more about themselves in the state. And her reforms are a lot of things. She did a lot of things. If you study about Maria Theresa, she centralized the Habsburg power. It's one of the things like based in Vienna. They began to modernize their empire. They'll do more of that by the 19th century, of course. She adopted the German language, which you'll see later is not very popular with the Hungarians who have, their own language, that kind of thing. That's things that she did do. They modernized the military. She had a council of state that advised her on matters of, ruling. She revamped the educational system also in the empire. She even had her own civil law code system she developed. The Codex, really called if you want to call it the Theresia Code or Codex Theresianus as well. And a lot of these other powers were also doing the same thing in Europe at the time, creating law codes and things like that. Because I think in Prussia they were doing it. Later, Napoleon does it, like the Napoleonic Code, a little later. When she came to power in 1740, she had a lot of trouble. There were powers that really didn't want her to be on the throne because she's a woman. Anyway, they had this deal into the north in Prussia. We'll talk about Prussia next week, but Prussia was ruled by this king named Frederick the Great. And He was kind of a major rival to her. In fact, he was a threat to her empire, like in the northern areas of it. And it sparked a series of wars that became known as the War of the Austrian Succession in Europe from 1740 to 48. And Prussia fought them in what they call the Silesian Wars, where they fought over a territory you see on the bottom right there, which is called Silesia, which was actually part of the Holy Roman Empire. And he basically swooped in there and stole it from her. And he'll also take Saxony as well. So he starts gobbling territory from Holy Roman Empire, and he's going to form the Prussian state out of it over time, Frederick the Great. But those two did not like each other. Frederick, I think, at one point actually had this idea to marry her, but she hated him. And I think there was a case where I think she told one of her advisors something like that, saying that evil man, he couldn't stand him, and all that. But they'll get involved in a lot of wars, or even involved in war, like the 7 Years' War, Austria and Prussia. They kind of fight each other for a bunch of years. Later, they're allies, if you know about that, like in World War One, etc. But that at the time they were kind of considered, enemies. There's some later rulers that are kind of famous, also as well known. This one is considered like one of the most famous rulers, I think, after Maria Theresa that you really read about, which is Jose II. He was Holy Roman Emperor from 1765 to 1790. He's very famous for his enlightened reforms in Europe. He was a big proponent of the Age of Enlightenment, and a lot of people kind of consider him to be one of the best examples of an enlightened despot. I think that one, and maybe I want to say Frederick the Great and Catherine the Great, they're probably well known for that too. And his reforms were so well known in the Habsburg Empire that it was called Josephinism, which I think was kind of a nickname that they kind of made fun of it because some of his reforms they thought went too far. But there were some things that he did do that are kind of famous. Like I know he gave a lot of religious rights to people like Jews and Protestants. That's something you start seeing where the Jews are kind of emancipated in Europe. You see this in Germany too, like in Prussia, they start emancipating them also as well. But he went further, like he even banned like capital punishment and torture and things like that. He built I think he even built like insane asylums. He's the one, I think they think he's the one that kind of developed that Schönbrunn Zoo. They say a lot. But I think they think some of his reforms went too far. When the French Revolution broke out, there were some cases where they were trying to reverse some of them a little later. There are some other rulers that reigned later. There's, of course, Jose II right there. Yeah, there's some other things he did that are kind of surprising about Jose II. He abolished serfdom. It's something you start seeing a lot in Europe in the 80s, because in Prussia they do the same thing as well. So yeah, freedom of religion, civic rights to Protestants and Jews. So I just talked about that with the patent of tolerations that came out. Freedom of the press was something he did that was kind of interesting with that. Reform the judicial system. Yeah, actually, at one point he got rid of capital punishment like the death penalty and torture, which is interesting thing about that as well. There was one thing that was controversial about Jose II. He created a separation of church and state, which kind of angered the Catholic Church, but he forced them to close a lot of their like monasteries and stuff because he wanted only them to be used maybe for like schools or something like that. So that was one thing that was kind of controversial about him. You can see he established hospitals, insane asylums, poorhouses, and orphanages also as well. He also was a big patron of the arts, especially with music. If you know about classical music at the time, you get a lot of artists like Mozart that come out. And he was a big fan of Mozart, who at one point was a court composer for him. But yeah, there are other rulers that kind of come later. You can see for a while after his mother died, he kind of ruled by himself for about 10 years, from 1780 to 1790. He had a brother that he had, and there's his sister, by the way. Marie Antoinette, who would be married to eventually the King of France, who's later Louis the 16th. He was unable; they were unable to save her later. The Habsburgs. If you know about her, she's kind of the so-called tragic queen that's later killed on the guillotine in the French Revolution. I think the Habsburgs later try to back counter revolutions against the French Revolution, but she's kind of a tragic figure, one of the daughters of Maria Theresa. Yeah, there's Francis II. He's a later ruler. They do have Leopold II, who died. He only ruled for about 2 years, from 1790 to 92. But if you know about Francis II, he's a nephew of Jose II, and he basically is one of the last Holy Roman emperors that you have. Eventually, it's going to be abolished, that position, which a lot of it had to do with Napoleon. The fact that Napoleon, between the late 18th, 19th century, eventually takes over Europe. Is what's going to occur because of the rise of Napoleon. And so in 1806, it's actually dissolved, the Holy Roman Emperor. And so what ends up happening with Leopold, Leopold ends up becoming what they call the first emperor of Austria, because they'll drop the title of Holy Roman Emperor. And so he goes from being Emperor Francis II, Holy Roman Emperor, to being Emperor Francis I of the Austrian Empire. So 1806 to, I guess, about 1867, that's kind of the nickname they call Habsburg Empire. It's called the Austrian Empire afterwards. And it'll eventually have different rulers that evolve over time, because eventually you'll end up with this other empire that is kind of the evolution of it, which will be the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which I'll get to it later. Austro-Hungarian Empire was this dual monarchy of Austria and Hungary that emerged in 1867, so-called, I think they call it the Austro-Hungarian Compromise that they have. And it was actually a constitutional monarchy of the Habsburg Lorraine dynasty in power at the time. And they basically control vast amounts of territory, which I showed you in that map earlier that I had earlier, which was mostly in southern Central Europe, based around Austria and Hungary. But Austria and Hungary were the only ones that really had any real power overall. They even have their own separate parliaments. Like Austria had a parliament, Hungary had a parliament, but they had a combined army that they had overall. The Habsburg rulers of Austria-Hungary are sometimes called Emperor King because basically they ruled as Emperor of Austria and the King of Hungary. Like I said, they had separate parliaments. They had even separate prime ministers, but with a unified military overall. You're looking at the most famous ruler, of course, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was actually the ruler from 1848 to 1916, which he almost ruled 68 years. In fact, he was at one point considered one of the longest reigning monarchs in Europe. I think he might be one of the longest reigning male rulers overall. They say he was born in the Schönbrunn Palace and died in the Schönbrunn Palace. Kind of give you an idea of how long he's in power. But he's the actual monarch when World War I breaks out. His nephew, Franz Ferdinand, was supposed to be the actual ruler and was supposed to take over, but he died, got assassinated in 1914. But these are all the different rulers they have later. So you have Francis I, who was originally Francis II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Ferdinand I, of course, there was actually a ruler before him that was briefly reigned. Franz Joseph I. They had one more ruler who did reign until 1916, 1918, which is Charles I as well, but he's kind of not well known, of course, after that. But we'll talk more about Habsburgs later when I get more into talking about like the 1800s. I'll kind of get later into that. I'll kind of talk more about the rise of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that they have, and we'll also talk about the rivalry between Germany and Austria-Hungary, because that really, if you know about it, leads into why Germany forms. Germany is going to break away from really the central southern part of Europe. They'll kind of separate those two, of course. And you'll see like the German Empire in the north, and then of course Austria-Hungary in the south, Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so those are the two rival states that you'll have, when World War One, of course, breaks out. So yeah, next week I'll kind of continue talking about the age of Habsburg. I'll kind of get into talk about the rise of Prussia, because Prussia, is going to lead into later the German Reich or German Empire that emerges in Europe in the 19th century. And we'll also talk about the rise of Russia as well, especially the Romanov dynasty that we have. We'll get to them the most, talk about them, because I'll kind of talk about Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, those kind of rulers, which are really some of the most famous and kind of a controversial topic right now, I know, because you got that Russian-Ukraine war that's going on now.